My name's Tara Mittelberg. I did my circumnavigation in 2016, and my topic was progressing the conversation on GMOs. Chicago chapter was the sponsoring club for my trip. I went to Northwestern University, and I studied international studies and environmental science. The countries I went to were Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, Ghana, Malaysia, and the Philippines. The purpose of my circumnavigation was to move the conversation on GMOs from something that's very binary, pro-GMO versus anti-GMO, to something that was more nuanced. And to do so, I was talking to farmers and scientists, and even people from the general public to understand different perspectives on GMOs and how they are used in different countries. GMO is actually a very large term that encompasses a lot of different types of technology. A transgenic crop is generally what people are talking about when they say GMO. And a transgenic crop is one crop that has been engineered to have the gene of another organism inside of it. And so, for example, there are some crops that have been genetically modified to be resistant to insects. And so that means that scientists discovered another species that's resistant to insects. In this case, it's a bacteria. They took the gene that allows that bacteria to produce the chemical that is harmful to insects, and they took that gene and put it into a corn plant, for example. And now the corn can use its own machinery and its own cells to produce that chemical that previously only this bacteria could make. And so that's what we call a BT crop. BT is the nickname for this particular trait. It sounds a little scary, but in reality, so for example, this chemical that the bacteria makes originally, if farmers apply this chemical to corn, just the chemical, it's considered an organic insecticide. Mm-hmm. And so the difference is just that the corn is making the chemical instead of the bacteria making the chemical. And so in very basic terms, that's what a transgenic crop is. But there are a lot of different types of GMOs. There's a new type called CRISPR-Cas9. It's a new method for genetically engineering organisms. And that one allows for easier transfer of genes between species. And so the big issues are some things that I touched upon in my circumnavigation. One of them is that a lot of the technologies and methods that are used to get the gene from one organism to another, those technologies are owned by certain companies, like particularly large, like chemical and biotechnology companies. And so it can be expensive for one, it can make the seeds more expensive. Two, it can make it so that only the large companies can afford to use that technology because it is so expensive. And because of that, a lot of the downsides to GMOs on the anti-GMO side, for example, are related to corporate ownership of them. However, there are opportunities for farmers. Oftentimes the transgenic crops are less expensive to use. They can have yield enhancing benefits. In the case of certain crops that are used to control weeds, it saves so much time for farmers because weed control is extremely time consuming and extremely expensive normally. And so it makes it a lot easier to be able to use these technologies for farmers. And profit margins for farmers are really small. So any little bit is really helpful for them. There's a whole bunch of, and then there's like the whole consumer side. There are lots of issues. Those are the ones that I'm most interested in though. In Argentina, I visited a small research institution in Rosario, which is a city about 4 hours outside of Buenos Aires. It was a small research institute. In there, I spoke with scientists. I also got to meet with farmers. It was my first stop in my circumnavigation. And so I was also just like getting acclimated to traveling by myself, was attempting to speak Spanish the best I could, although that was challenging. When I was in Argentina, I stayed with some friends that I knew from a previous abroad experience I had had. I studied abroad in Ecuador, and my host siblings from that experience lived in Buenos Aires. And so they took me on this wild sightseeing day where we went all over the city. And they were experts at navigating the public transportation and the buses, and I was really grateful for them. In Brazil, I revisited an institution that I'd conducted an internship at previously. They're an institution that researches soybean genetics. And while I was in Brazil, I learned a lot about crops that are resistant to herbicides. And so that was a major topic of investigation in Brazil. Because I had connections there already, I spoke to a ton of grad students, a ton of scientists, and got less formal conversations about GMOs in Brazil. And that was really valuable for my experience, understanding how people just talk about them in everyday conversation. My experience in Brazil inspired me to develop a research question and a research project that I then went on to write a Fulbright grant application for, and then won a Fulbright grant to go back and study my Brazilian case study. And so that was a really meaningful stop for me. So Embrapa is the research institution that I visited in Brazil. It's located in Londrina, and they conduct a variety of studies to make sure that GMOs are not harmful to the environment and not harmful to human health. And so I had the opportunity to visit test fields, and some scientists showed me those fields, and those are at the Embrapa research station. In South Africa, I spoke to several different researchers. I went to one institution that studies tree genetics, and they were researching ways to make trees for paper or lumber more productive using genetic technologies. I also visited a scientist named Jennifer Thompson there, who had developed a trait that provides resistance to a certain disease in corn. And this particular trait has the potential to help smallholder farmers who are corn farmers. I also went to Monsanto there, which was interesting because this contrasted a lot with the smaller research institutions that I was visiting in my other case studies. And they were working on a major project to produce corn that's resistant to drought in different parts of Africa. Another fun thing about going to South Africa is that my time in Cape Town overlapped with Carolyn Harris, who was another circumnavigator the same year as me in Cape Town. And so we hung out, we sight saw together, we had dinner, and she was researching something to do with bacterial resistance to antibiotics. And we found that our research had very similar themes in it related to public perceptions, and this being like a very scientific issue that is also very much in the public conversation and very much affected by public perception. I usually say Ghana was the highlight of my trip. I was in the northern part of the country in Tamale, and I was talking to scientists at a project that's trying to make cowpea, which is also called black-eyed pea, resistant to insects. And this particular project was interesting because it's very much a subsistence crop, unlike corn or soybeans, which was what I was researching in other places. And so the intention of this project is to develop black-eyed pea for smallholder farmers to plant. Another highlight of Ghana was that I stayed in an Airbnb with 2 local hosts and spent a couple weeks with them, and they were extremely kind and wonderful cooks and included me in their family and friend outings. We went to the markets, we went around town. I made fufu with them, which is this very labor intensive type of starch that people there eat with soup. And so that was a highlight, was getting to really get to know people there, especially in a place that I probably wouldn't have visited outside of this type of project. In Malaysia, I was primarily in Kuala Lumpur. Here, I was talking to scientists who were working on developing a papaya that ripens later than a papaya would normally ripen after you pick it. And this case study was interesting because it's a trait that affects consumers, because presumably it allows you to have papaya that's fresher and not mushy, versus the other traits I was looking at, which is primarily for farmers. While I was in Kuala Lumpur, I also met with a social scientist who researches perceptions of GMOs, primarily in Malaysia and other places in Southeast Asia. And so she spoke to me about the religious context of GMOs, for example, in a heavily Muslim country. And it was interesting to hear her perspective as well and get them more. So she brought up the need to educate people and also to study more how people are thinking about them. And yeah, she just essentially brought up the need to make sure that any type of development of transgenic crops is culturally appropriate. In the Philippines, I went to the International Rice Research Institute. This is, in the case study I studied there, is golden rice, which is kind of the poster child for the pro-GMO movement. It's a type of rice that has been genetically modified to be higher in beta carotene, which can help, which is a major deficiency in a lot of places with poor nutritional outcomes. And so, and without this particular nutrient, it causes childhood blindness. And so the golden rice will allegedly ward off childhood blindness. However, there's been a lot of challenges they've done field trials and they've produced the rice, but there have been challenges getting it commercialized. And so it hasn't been commercialized yet. But it's something that like the pro-GMO movement raises is like, wow, GMOs are amazing. Look, we can prevent blindness. And so it's interesting to speak with the researchers who are on that project about like some of the challenges they had because it is a very public project. And so they had a lot of thoughts on public perceptions and how that influences GMO research and development. I also met with Greenpeace there, again, related to public perceptions. And I talked to them about some of their campaigns against GMOs for reasons related to food sovereignty, related to environmental sustainability. Even though most of my trip was talking to scientists, it made me realize the importance of policy and regulation in the production of any type of technology, and particularly agricultural technology. A lot of the researchers, whether they were at big organizations or like small universities or small non-for-profit institutions, their main challenges were just trying to get their crops like deregulated. And because of this policy challenge and regulation challenge, it's really only the big institutions that can afford to produce GM crops because it's so expensive to go through the regulatory processes. And because of this, like only crops that are going to be high profit, like corn and soy, are really good candidates to be genetically modified. And so I found that because of these regulatory challenges, the rhetoric of GMOs being necessary for food security, for example, it doesn't always hold up because it is so challenging to deregulate crops that are specifically designed for smallholder farmers and to address food. Two of my case studies were especially important during my last year of college. And my senior thesis focused on GM black-eyed pea in Ghana. And then also during my senior year, I wrote a research proposal about a research question I had identified in Brazil during my circumnavigation. And then that research proposal was funded by a Fulbright grant. And so right after I graduated from college, and then I did a year-long Fulbright grant in Brazil where I was researching social and economic barriers to farmers sustainably managing weeds on their farms. And I was particularly looking at herbicide-resistant weeds. And from there, I was based in DC for 2.5 years. I was working at NORC at the University of Chicago, and I was researching international development, particularly agricultural development, and was also researching labor issues. And then currently I am at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm continuing to focus on Brazil work, which I attribute somewhat to probably the base of that was my circumnavigation with my interest in Brazil. I'm not working on GMO issues anymore. I'm looking at supply chain sustainability, particularly cattle supply chains in Brazil. But the qualitative research skills, just the baseline knowledge about agriculture and the challenges that farmers face that I learned during my circumnavigation have been tremendously helpful even now in like starting my graduate school. After my circumnavigation, I had a Fulbright grant come directly out of it. From there, I worked full-time in a research position that was also looking at international development and agricultural issues. And then now I'm a graduate student at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and my research is also focused on sustainability and agricultural issues. I'm sure I got into the program and got the funding that I have in part because of the Circumnavigators grant and Fulbright grant, not to mention just the research skills that I learned. I learned a lot about being independent and solo travel during this experience. When you're by yourself, you're really forced to build your own community and build your own connections. And I met so many interesting people that way. And so I think in that sense, personally, that trip made me more outgoing and more willing to put myself out there and talk to different people and listen to different people's stories and really pursue. And so I would encourage future scholars to be bold in the types of people they're emailing, asking for interviews. I remember reaching out to professors or scientists. I'm like, wow, they seem really, really high in their field and really fancy. They're never going to respond to me. And then they did. And then I had really excellent interviews with them. And it was great for both my research and even for networking. And so I'd recommend that future scholars shoot big and what they're aiming for. And that goes for any type of planning. Or the Circumnavigators grant is really indescribable in terms of how amazing of an opportunity it is. It's an incredible chance to study an issue close up in many different places. And it's really hard to do comparative research in general. And so being able to look at this thing that you're so passionate about in so many different contexts, seeing how it's the same, seeing how it's different, seeing things you never thought you even knew about it. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity, and I'd encourage anybody to apply. I'm incredibly grateful for this opportunity that I had 5 years ago. And it's been something that changed my college career. It changed, frankly, my entire career and me as a person. And I'm thankful to have had this opportunity to be involved with it. And I hope the Circumnavigators Club continues to do this for another 50 years because it's really great work that they do.